has been suggested that African elephants, Loxodon africana, are highly interested by the skulls and ivory of deceased members of their own species. It has also been suggested that they go to visit the deceased bodies of members of their own family. In the article entitled Elephant Interests in Skull and Ivory by Karen McComb, L. Baker, and C. Moss, 3 experiments were carried out within the Amboseli National Park in Kenya between the years of 1998 and 2000 on the free-ranging elephant families within the national park. The purpose of this experiment was to determine whether the elephants were attracted to specifically elephant bones, and if so, were they attracted to their own matriarch's skull, or was it just a general attraction to the elephant bones? In the first experiment, 19 family groups of elephants were presented with 3 objects: a piece of wood, a piece of ivory, and an elephant skull. All 3 items were placed 30 metres from the herd and were aligned next to each other so that the herd could inspect. In the second experiment, 17 family groups were presented with an elephant skull, a rhinoceros skull, and a buffalo skull. Again, each was set out next to each other 30 metres from the herd. The third experiment consisted of 3 matriarchal skulls, which were presented to 3 family groups which had lost a matriarch in the previous 1 to 5 years. When the results were collaborated, the first experiment showed that there was a significantly higher interest in the piece of ivory that was presented along with the wood and the skull. Although there was a high preference to the ivory, there was also a very strong preference to the elephant skull as opposed to the piece of wood. As you can see by the graph shown on the screen, which was taken from the journal article, the preference to ivory is significantly more than the other 2 options given to the elephant groups. The second experiment showed that there was a significantly high preference towards the elephant skull as opposed to the rhinoceros and the buffalo skull, even though the rhinoceros skull was probably the rarest item that an elephant would come across. As you can see on the graph on the screen representing experiment 2, again, the elephant skull was significantly more preferenced as opposed to the other 2, even though the rhinoceros skull was slightly more interesting. In the third and final experiment, the results showed that although the elephants were incredibly interested in each of the skulls, it did not appear that they could distinguish which one belonged to their matriarch. Although there was a slight preference towards certain matriarchal skulls, there wasn't the significant preference that had been shown in the previous 2 experiments. As you can see in the graph that represents experiment 3, there's only a very slight difference in the preferences between matriarchal and non-matriarchal, but definitely not the significant increase that was shown in the previous 2 experiments. Although the first 2 experiments do strongly suggest that elephants have a high interest in interacting with the bones and tusks of deceased animals of the same species, the third experiment does not strongly suggest that they can identify members of their own families and their own matriarchs.